Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Beth Keeton from Griffin-Hammis Associates. We're a national customized employment firm and currently working all over the country to support customized employment and transformation of states. And that's what we're really here to talk about today. It's what I'm calling CE, or customized employment in the real world, looking at states, looking at outcomes, looking at sustainability. And the focus of this presentation today is less on specific states and what they are doing or specific outcomes that they're achieving, and more on what it is that we're seeing as we're beginning to work with states throughout the country, make that transformation away from customized employment as a demonstration project, as it was for many, many years, and now really trying to create a sustainable foundation to ensure CE services are accessible by any particular individual with a disability or any employment seeker with a disability as mandated by the legislation, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunities Act. So the nature of CE itself hasn't changed, but I think the goal and the target of it has changed a lot over the last 5 years. And with that has come increased learning and increased knowledge about what it takes, again, to go beyond just making CE a potential service available to an individual in a particular provider agency, and instead creating this platform for guaranteeing access to all. I thought it would be helpful to just start with the goal and really talk about what we at GAHA think of when we're thinking about or starting work with states in pursuit of this CE platform, this sustainable platform for customized employment services. And this goal is written in a very simple way. But I think that it's a lot more profound as you start to dig into it. And so our essential goal is making sure that any person with any disability who would benefit from a customized approach to employment, so who would benefit from the strategies associated with customized employment, has access to best practice CE services. There are things inherent in this definition, or presumptions or assumptions. And so the first of that is going to be the presumption that best practice CE services lead to high quality employment outcomes. And so it is critical for states to ensure that they're enacting and maintaining processes that support fidelity to best practice CE, right? So that's inherent in this definition, is that when we're talking about CE, we're really talking about fidelity to best practice CE, and that by definition then, by extension, those are going to lead to, those practices will lead to high quality employment outcomes. Once we get beyond that though, that foundational presumption, I think what we're really talking about here is equal access, right? And ensuring access to anybody who would benefit from CE services, or parity of access, which I'll be calling it for the rest of the presentation. And when we're looking at equal access and creating a foundation for this parity of access, what you'll discover is that this really goes beyond training. Typically, when somebody calls Griffin-Hammis Associates and asks us to come in and support them, either a provider agency or a state, or even a family, when they're calling to ask for support with customized employment, a lot of times what they're looking for is training. And training is critical, right? Training is the foundational element for all of this transformation work. But when we're looking instead at equal access, when we're looking at this broader goal, what we begin to understand is that this is far deeper than just training. And this is really beginning to look at the systems, the processes, the policies, the procedures, and the collaboration between all the different entities involved in providing employment services, and making sure that they're operating functionally and collaboratively to support this broader goal. And that is not something that you're going to achieve through training alone, right? And so that's what we're going to dive deep into in the next 20 or 30 minutes, or at least as deeply as you can dive in 20 or 30 minutes. But looking at what does parity of access really look like across the board, and then how does that align with, or what's the interplay between that and then the training request, right? The need for training that we know still exists. The first parity of access component I'm going to talk about is something that I call demographics. And I'm not really sure that demographics, honestly, is the very best word for this. But I was trying to hit some of the basic foundational elements of this that really we're talking about when we're talking about equal access, right? And so fundamentally, when we're talking about equal access, when we're talking about parity of access, ensuring that any person who would benefit from a customized approach has access, we're talking about equal access regardless of the things listed on this slide, right? And so the first one is disability label. So any person who would benefit is a statement that goes beyond a particular disability label. A lot of times when we talk about customized employment, it's become more synonymous with a process or a set of strategies that would benefit an individual or individual employment seekers who experience a developmental disability or who experience an intellectual disability. And customized employment can be super beneficial in those cases. But the reality is that customized employment itself is a set of strategies designed to support people who are not benefiting from more traditional employment supports, right? And so it's this idea that if you're not benefiting, if more traditional assessments or vocational rehabilitation, or vocational evaluations, if those more standard information gathering tools aren't revealing what we need to know about the employment seeker to develop a individualized and beneficial plan for employment, then we need a different strategy. And so in the case of customized employment, that's discovery, right? So instead of relying on some of the norm reference tools or the more standard evaluation practices, we're gonna forego assessment altogether and say instead we're gonna spend time with this person in their life learning about them, that's gonna reveal the information that we need in order to go forth and develop that career plan, that job development plan, right? The other piece of, or another key piece of customized employment is customized job development. So instead of starting from a list of labor market needs or starting from a list of jobs that are available or opportunities that employers identify as critical needs of theirs, instead of starting from what's open, what's needed, we're going to instead use the information we gathered during discovery to meet with employers, to meet with businesses that are in fields that may be of interest to the person that we just met through discovery, and use conversation and negotiation as a way to identify unmet needs, right? Create positions that would be potentially mutually beneficial to that business and to the individual. So we're creating employment based on what would work for the person and what would work for the business, not based on existing job descriptions. And there are a lot of people who can benefit from a more customized approach to employment, right? There are a lot of people who can benefit from the gathering of more in-depth information through a discovery process and through this opportunity to just meet with employers and explore what their needs are, not necessarily identified in existing job descriptions, but when they look at their business practices as a whole. So we want to make sure that we're not pigeonholing or defining customized employment services as being specific to a particular disability label, but more recognizing that it's a set of strategies that go beyond some of the existing job and employment strategies now, and we want to make sure that whoever could benefit from them have access to them, right? In keeping with that, we also need to make sure that people have equal access regardless of the service system. There are some states, for example, where the Medicaid waiver services through maybe the developmental disabilities waiver funds discovery, but the state VR agency maybe doesn't have a core activity for discovery funded at this moment. And in cases like that, individuals who are served by the DD waiver have access to discovery and customized employment, but individuals who are served by the state vocational rehabilitation do not. So it's the service system that's dictating access, not the need of the individual employment seeker, right? And so we've got to make sure that there's equal access across these service systems. And in keeping with what I just said about it should be a service that's available regardless of disability label, that means any of the services that provide employment services to individuals who experience disabilities need to have a pathway to customized employment. Right? So vocational rehabilitation agencies, blind service agencies, behavioral health care, developmental disabilities agencies, the Medicaid waiver, all of these, workforce, the American Job Centers, all of these need to be offering equal access to customized employment if, in fact, that is a service that is presumed to benefit this particular service recipient or job seeker. We also want to see people have equal access regardless of what state they live in, right? And that sounds like a very obvious statement. And the reality is that states are in all different places right now in terms of the CE services that they're offering or that they're developing. And that's very understandable because this was just embedded within the federal policy and federal law within the last 5 years. But ultimately, I think in terms of the broader goal, you do want to get to a scenario where somebody has equal access to best practice customized employment services, regardless of whether they live in Virginia, Georgia, Washington, Montana, Texas, or anywhere in between, right? That it's not the state itself that dictates it, but that everybody, wherever you live, can have the same access. And along those same lines, I would say, really looking at communities. So one of the things that we see as a big challenge within states right now, I put urban/rural on the slide because that's one of the big dividers a lot of times, but you'll see a challenge with having providers serve the rural areas. So you may find that customized employment is available only in the cities, but people who live in more rural communities don't have access to it, or people who live in more rural communities, maybe there's only one provider who serves that area, so they don't have the same range of choice that people who live in urban communities do. And all of these are things that we have to really be thinking through when we're trying to create that state plan for customized employment, and how is it that we're going to support it across the state. The next thing I would say with the parity of consideration is this quality of services, or the quality assurance component. And again, what I said in the very beginning with the goal is this ties into that presumption that best practice customized employment, or best practice CE, leads to high quality employment outcomes. And so if that's the case, then what we need is a universal standard throughout the state, throughout the service systems, for what constitutes best practice CE, right? And then everything that states are designing in terms of quality assurance need to align with that standard as the broader goal. So, and this is going to get, I think when we talk about the state data collection systems, looking at systems that really support fidelity to best practice service delivery, right? So really defining clearly what is best practice discovery. At Griffin-Hammis, we have a fidelity scale that we're in the process of field testing and researching and using to say, this is what best practice discovery is. This is a standard that exists outside of state service system, anything, right? It's a universal standard. And so what we need to do is make sure that everybody in the state is then trained to that standard so that they have a way to evaluate the practices. And then we also always need to make sure that that's tied to this employment outcome research and employment outcome data, because again, it's not just adherence to the fidelity scale or the fidelity measure. It's adherence to a fidelity scale and a fidelity measure that continues to demonstrate that by adhering to it, we reach good quality outcomes, right? So these two have to be intertwined always. We have to make sure that we're constantly evaluating the services being delivered to make sure that they uphold to the standard. And then we have to continue to evaluate on an ongoing basis, are we getting where we need to be with regard to the actual employment outcomes? Because all of this is for naught if people aren't actually getting jobs, right? And again, I think what I'm saying sounds obvious, and yet what we're finding are enormous holes in this when we get out and we really begin to work with states, where we don't necessarily see this universal standard going across agencies, across communities, across service systems. And that leaves a lot of opportunity for variance in the nature and the range of CE services. And again, if we're really trying to get to best quality, sustainable foundation, these are some of the pieces that I think we need to have to clean up on the front end. You'll see a lot of these slides and a lot of these points build from each other, right? So the next thing I want to talk about is just policy and the parity of access within policy. And I think there's a tremendous amount of opportunity here and within the quality of services to address the points that I made on that first parity slide about the ensuring quality of access across states, communities, and service systems, right? You'll see how all of these things come together. WIOA mandates, a lot of different service policies mandate cross-system collaboration. But I think when we work with states to really look at creating this foundation for CE, we begin to see that this is critical and crucial functionally, right? So this is not collaboration in name only, but this is really truly beginning to work together to say, how do we align policy? And then underneath that, if we have this alignment of policy, if we have this alignment of practice, then you have better opportunities to collaborate and co-fund, right? And make the funding dollars, make the service agency dollars go farther in terms of supporting a broader effort for customized employment and getting away from this bifurcation we have, or these silos that we otherwise have, where we have one system defining things one way and another system defining it a different way. So first, we want universal and standards and language for just what I said, best practice CE. So coming to an agreement of what does best practice CE actually look like and entail, right? And making sure that that's in place and that all of the different systems, the DD service system, the vocational rehabilitation system, the behavioral healthcare system, the Medicaid waiver language, all of these things are in agreement and defining best practice CE the same way. And then once you get that standard in place to ensure that, again, the quality of the CE isn't going to vary depending on whether you're served through the state vocational rehabilitation agency or the behavioral healthcare services, right? That we know universally CE is the same process, it's the same standard. Then I think there's better opportunity to collaborate things around things like provider credentialing. This is one of the big gaps that we see across the country. So anything that I'm talking about in terms of what we see is not just in one state, right? These are all universal challenges. And some of them I think are absolutely understandable and to be expected, given the fact, again, that we're just trying to move towards this best practice CE implementation. But what we tend to see is either very little, if anything, in terms of provider credentialing standards around customized employment. So it may be X number of years of services, employment services, or some level of a degree plus a certain number of years of services, employment service experience. Or we tend to see different requirements for different agencies. So it's not uncommon at all to have a state VR agency that's beginning to work through credentialing requirements saying, we want providers to have some combination of base level training and customized employment, plus some mentored field work, right? So we want to actually have a performance-based component where they're delivering services to an individual and demonstrating that they can provide CE services with fidelity. And then having another state agency who just has only the training requirement in place. And what happens then is we get inconsistent standards across agencies that impact provider development, right? And so in an ideal world, as states are working, what would be the best standard is to ensure that whatever the credential for a provider is for the state VR agency, it's the same expectation, it's the same credential for the behavioral healthcare system, the state DD agency, the workforce system, everybody who's involved in providing these services. It makes it cleaner in terms of expectations for the providers. And again, it provides consistency of services for the employment seeker, which is where it really matters the most. Otherwise, the quality and the experience of the provider that is providing service to the employment seeker is dictated by the service that's funding them and not by this universal standard for what is it that constitutes best practice CE services. When we look at provider credentialing too, this is just one of the things that I'd love to throw out there for people to be thinking about. A lot of times when there is focus on credentialing or the requirements, it's the initial requirements, right? So what does somebody need to have in place to begin providing the service? And in the states where we're working, a lot of them, again, are moving towards a tiered credential, right? Where there is the initial 40 hours of CE training or whatever it is that they're requiring, but then there is some demonstration, some actual receive a CE referral, work with somebody, receive mentoring and technical assistance and guidance to ensure that you actually can demonstrate that you demonstrate, or that can demonstrate that you deliver the service effectively, right? You help somebody get to a customized employment outcome effectively. But we also need to be looking at, what does it take for somebody to maintain their credential? Historically, when we're talking about employment services, the credential maintenance also is linked only to training. But the reality is that C is service delivery. The actual doing of it that is the most critical. And so we're really encouraging states to make sure that credential maintenance is not just contingent upon continuing education, and continuing education is great, but that it is contingent upon continuing to deliver high quality services with fidelity to the standard, right? And again, that's why the first slide that I talked about, or the last one, was on ensuring that all of these states, all of these systems are agreeing on what that standard is, right? And again, you can see I'm talking how this really does begin to ensure equal access, because all of these points are points of potential variation then for the job seeker, the employment seeker, if the state isn't establishing this clear and universal standard. So people who work for an agency or people who receive services from an agency that has a higher credentialing requirement, theoretically have access to better quality services than those who receive services from an agency who doesn't have as in-depth of a credentialing requirement. We also would love to see and highly recommend conversation around and designing systems and supports around some universal standards for provider payment when it comes to CE services. So I wrote provider fee codes on here. It's not always called fee codes in each of the different service systems, but one of the big areas of challenge that we continue to see in states are different service entities funding services related to customized employment at different rates. And in some cases, they're funding only a component of the service, right? So we may see a state VR agency, for example, that is funding discovery at a pretty high rate, but a state DD agency that's funding it at a much lower rate. And if this happens, then what you tend to see are providers who want to provide discovery or CE for vocational rehabilitation, but not to do it as a Medicaid waiver service, right? And again, this negatively impacts the quality of the services that an employment seeker receives. The other things that we sometimes see are inconsistency with fee codes even within an agency. So you may see a vocational rehabilitation agency that's funding discovery at a pretty high rate, but when it goes into customized job development, it's just using existing fee codes for job development, and there's no distinction between customized job development and more traditional job development, right? And in order, I think, to really fully support CE, customized employment, not just discovery, we need to make sure that this service is fully funded in a way that meets the financial needs of the providers delivering the service, right? That they're able to bill the cost of providing the service all the way across. So that's going to include discovery, customized job development, consultative employment supports, which is the on-site training that you see associated with customized employment. And then you need to see uniformity, or at least alignment between those fees between the different agencies. And then finally, the last piece of this, the quality assurance implementation evaluation. Again, that goes back to what I talked about previously in terms of ensuring that there is this standard, right? That the first thing is agreeing upon the standard, whatever the quality services are, the quality assurances for best practice CE. And then we want to make sure that everybody, to the degree possible, all these different entities are using the same evaluation standards. So if it's submitting discovery and CE documentation for review for 2 job seekers per year, that's the same standard for maintenance and assurance of ongoing credentialing for each of the different service agencies involved. The last bullet on this slide I put here just to lead into the next one. So the fee codes and the payment for providers, the funding of the CE service delivery is really what I'm talking about on this one. But we also want to recognize that the funding of the services received, right, what it takes to complete CE services for the individual job seekers also requires some different funding than traditional employment services. And to the degree possible, our recommendation is that states use their existing policy to meet these kind of funding requirements until such time as they have time to rewrite their waivers, rework the VR policy, and the fee codes within that. And I'll talk about that more now as we move into this next slide. So again, when I talk about funding here, this parity of access with regard to funding, I'm not talking about payments to providers, right? Payments to providers, we just talked about the importance of making sure that the payments aligning across agencies and that it's fully funded to align with what it costs a provider to deliver best practice CE services. But now I'm talking about actually CE services themselves, right? The CE process, the strategies that we're using and that an employment seeker is receiving. Customized employment relies upon flexible strategies for job creation by definition. If you go to the federal definition of what customized employment is, we utilize flexible strategies including resource ownership, including self-employment. So things that really support, again, not just finding jobs, but creating jobs. And what this means is that in order to fully receive CE services, right, to complete discovery, to complete customized job development, to negotiate jobs, job seekers, employment seekers may need access to different kinds of funding than are currently factored into existing employment services. So, discovery, for example, one of the things that is really critical for discovery is the completion of what we call discovery activities, right? So if I discover that somebody has, and working with them, I discover that they have really great mechanical skills, right? Or some initial mechanical skills. And I want to get out there and I want to connect them with an organization that restores old car engines, right? And there's this really cool 2-day workshop that's going on where everybody comes and they're given this, and they're given an engine, and there's an instructor in the class, and they go around, and again, everybody's restoring these engines, but it costs $150 to do this activity, right? Everybody who's coming in to restore the engine has to pay $150 for the materials and the instructor time and whatever. There is no code in existing policies, generally speaking, vocational rehabilitation waiver, whatever it is, that says here's how you fund a discovery activity. And what that ends up meaning functionally is a lot of times people avoid activities that cost money if they're not sure that they can get access to them, or individuals who receive services from bigger providers or providers with greater cash flow who can fund those kind of activities, or individuals who have families or friends or who they themselves have more resources. They get access to a different level of discovery than people who don't have those resources get access to, right? And so we need to make sure that we understand that activities like these are a critical component of discovery, and that there is a way for any employment seeker to access them, again, regardless of the service agency, and regardless of the fact that it may or may not be clearly spelled out in fee codes right now, or scope of services, how exactly you're going to fund that. Same thing for resource ownership, where somebody may, in that same example of somebody who has great mechanical skills, they may find that, you know, they're great with small engine repair. They go into a local auto shop, and that auto shop says, oh my gosh, yes, absolutely, we could hire somebody else, but we need this new piece of equipment that reads what's going on with engines. And then if we could have that equipment, we could service other automobiles that we're not servicing right now. And so a resource ownership policy would allow somebody to purchase that piece of equipment and thereby create a job for themselves, right? Right now, although that's an acceptable practice under CE, there's not anything that actually funds it, right? Telecommuting and self-employment are written into existing state policies. They're mandated services, but a lot of times the policies supporting them may rule out people who don't have certain backgrounds, certain experiences, or certain skill sets. And so we need to make sure, again, if we're talking about parity of access and equal access, that these policies and these funds are available to anybody who would benefit from them. The last point that I'm going to just comment on, and I know this is a big one, right? We could do an entire presentation on transportation, but I think the reality is right now there is not parity of access when it comes to transportation, depending on the particular service that somebody receives. So there may be transportation built into someone who attends a day service program, for example, but that same level of transportation is not available if they have employment in the community. So we need to make sure that systems are on board for helping people figure out and fund things like transportation to work and or transportation to discovery activities, right? Anything that's related to CE, the customized job development informational interviews, there needs to be a pathway and guidance for how it is that somebody who's receiving those services can get the transportation and the supports that they need. One of the things that I throw out there as a consideration, and of course this is something that all states have to consider on their own, it's going to vary depending on the particular waiver language or policies and the way that things are enacted, but in most cases, providing this kind of financial support for the employment seeker receiving the customized employment services does not require a major policy overhaul. It doesn't mean that policy may not be adjusted over the long run, but they can be funded right now, typically through the existing service scope, with a little bit of fine tuning and tweaking in terms of the recommendations and a lot of reassurance to whoever it is that's authorizing the services that that's okay. So for example, I should have put this on the slide, but this is actually from the federal definition of maintenance service, which is a VR service, and this is in 34 CFR, it's 361.5 definitions if anybody wants to look it up. But within the existing scope of services for federal VR, so federal VR policy allows for maintenance. And the definition of maintenance, this is pulled directly from legislation, says it means the monetary support provided to an individual for expenses that are in excess of the normal expenses of the individual. So it's monetary support provided to the individual for expenses that go beyond what they normally spend money on. And they are necessitated by, and it gives a couple of examples, but one of them is the individual's receipt of vocational rehabilitation services under an individual plan for employment, which essentially means if customized employment is written into the IPE and there are expenses associated with that, that maintenance could potentially pay for that. You know, so one of the things I throw out there is, could maintenance dollars be used to pay for discovery activity? Could maintenance dollars be available to pay for transportation to a discovery activity or transportation to an informational interview? There's another catch-all category in VR services, other goods and services, which just identifies funds for other goods and services that are necessitated by participation in or to receive services underneath this individual plan for employment. So if states are looking at how do we really support CE, I think it's important to recognize that there is the opportunity to provide guidance to case managers, to VR counselors, to whomever it is, on here's how you can use our existing policies to make sure that people do get access to the services. And again, to prevent this gap that can occur otherwise, where the quality, the duration, the extent of the services that somebody receives is driven by the resources they themselves have or the agencies that's supporting them versus the service that they're receiving, if that makes sense. Okay, so now we're just going to talk about some of the CE services and really the foundation for providing CE service. So I'm beginning to transition into the idea of training, right? So how do we provide the training and build the knowledge that is needed within the state system, within the provider agency system to truly support CE, right? So most of what I've been talking about before is what needs to be in place from a policy perspective, from a process or procedure perspective, in order to ensure equal access. But now we're getting into the nitty-gritty of, okay, what do we need to do when we get into states to start trying to train the people there and support them to actually deliver the services to the standard we're setting of best practice CE. called this slide the training fallacy. That's just my term for it. And I'm really looking for words to embrace, again, the concerns I have over this ongoing and almost exclusive focus we often have in the employment services field on training. And again, I want to be really clear before I go any further and throughout this presentation that I am not knocking the importance of training. We are a training, technical assistance and mentoring agency. We do a tremendous amount of training and really believe in the value of it. What we don't believe is that it alone will be sufficient to lead to the kind of change that we need to see in order for people to truly have access to best practice CE services. So there is a quote that's used oftentimes in the field of behavioral engineering, which is what I'm going to talk about now, that I just think is really profound and really accurate. And it says, if you pit a good performer against a bad system, the system will win almost every time. And this quote is by Gary Rumler and Alan Brock, who have written a book on behavioral engineering. And I'm going to talk through some of the components of this behavioral engineering model now, so we can talk about sort of where this all fits together. The reality, I think, when we're talking about CE service delivery, and I would say this is for anything, right? Employment service delivery, really anything we're talking about, is that this is one component that lives inside of broader systems, right? It's not something that's independent. Training for CE service delivery does not exist in its own vacuum, right? So CE services sit at the center. Usually the employment specialist who's providing the service and the job seeker who's receiving the service are supported, paid for, right? The employment specialist belongs to a community rehabilitation provider agency or an employment service provider agency. And so the employment specialist is influenced, and the services provided are influenced by the policies, the procedures, the beliefs, the core values, all of that, the processes within that provider agency. And then the provider agency is funded by service systems. And oftentimes these CE provider agencies are funded by a variety of service systems, right? And so the reality is that the policies, the processes, the payment structures, right? The focus, the intentionality of the services delivered by this provider agency are in fact directly influenced by the broader systems as a whole, right? And all of those broader systems. And so I think we need to understand that there is an inherent link and an inextricable link between all of these, right? There's no way to say we're going to separate out CE services from an employment service specialist perspective, from a provider agency perspective, from the system perspective, without understanding that there's all of these crossovers and influences that go between them, right? Service systems are influenced by the providers and vice versa. So it's back and forth across these different layers. There's a model, it's called the behavioral engineering model, and it was first introduced in a book. I'm gonna put on my glasses to read this. The book is called Human Competence, Engineering Worthy Performance by Gilbert in 1978. This was put out, right? And the idea was that this was to provide us with a way to systematically and systemically identify the barriers to individual and organizational performance. And so the key thing that Gilbert was trying to do when looking at performance, and when we're talking about performance here, we're talking about CE service delivery, right? And so typically the agent that's identified as being the CE service delivery agent is the employment specialist, okay? And so when we're looking at this particular person, and what we're seeing is that they're not getting to the quality outcomes, we're trying to identify what's the challenge, what's going wrong in terms of this person's ability to perform. And the model that I have here is based on the Gilbert model, and then which was updated by Chevalier in 2003, right? So this is the Chevalier model, which adjusts a little bit of the original behavioral engineering model set forth by Gilbert. The reason that I think this is so important for us to be thinking about is because this is really looking at performance and how to identify performance gaps, or the cause, really the cause analysis, the cause agent for performance gaps outside of any particular service field, outside of any particular service, right? So this is looking more broadly at what all goes into a worker performing effectively or ineffectively. In our field, and in a lot of fields, we have a real tendency to hyper-focus on one of these 6 areas, right? And that one is in the bottom left quadrant of this chart, the individual knowledge and skills, meaning the individual, the employment specialist, the performer, we tend to look at, do they have the training that they need, right? And that's what we're focusing on. And if we're not getting to our outcomes, then we need to adjust the training. And if we're not getting to our outcomes, we need more training, or different people need to be trained, right? And this is where we concentrate the bulk of our energy. But when you look at this, this is just one of 6. The top half of this chart is the environment. This is the systems level. And per the quote we just looked at, if we pit a good performer against a poor system, the system's gonna win every time. And what that means is that the broader impact, the broader potential for impacting change exists in the top half of this chart, right? Looking at the different systems. And some of the things that are really key here are there clearly defined roles and expectations? Is there a performance management system in place? So when we're looking at the individual employment specialist down here, is their role and are the expectations of their role clearly defined? Seems like they would be, but honestly, when we look at this, oftentimes they're not. Is there a performance management system in place, right? Is there quick, efficient, and direct feedback that goes to this employment specialist down here if things are off track? Oftentimes there is not, right? We look at the resources. Do they have sufficient materials, tools? And here's the big one that I should have put in all caps. Do they have time? Do they have the time they need? Do they have access to all the different resources and materials that they need in order to actually do the job, right? Are the processes and the procedures that they're to use clearly defined? When all we do is provide base training and then assume and presume that all the rest of this is just going to fall in place, it doesn't. And we see that again and again and again. Training does not equal clearly defined policies, processes, and procedures. It doesn't equal clearly defined roles and expectations. Training may inform those, right? It may be the foundation for those, but it does not in and of itself guarantee that they will be enacted or put in place. The third big category within the environment, the systems level, is the incentives. So are the financial and other incentives in place? And we see problems with this all the time. One of the things that's happened with states, and my next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit better about what I'm about to do here, which is bump between different systems and agency levels. But right now there is an enormous focus on transition, right? Because of the WIOA legislation, which is fabulous. Perfect, right? We need the focus on transition. But there's this category of services called pre-employment transition services. And a lot of times that's funded pretty well. And it may increase in intensity over the summer when students are out of their regular school programs, right? And so what we'll see sometimes are agencies that are funded at a higher rate to deliver pre-ET services. So in the summer, more of their time and attention goes to pre-ETs and less of their time and attention goes to customized employment, right? So are the financials lined up? And that's going to go from the level of the employment specialist. So are we paying them sufficiently? Do they have incentives? Are they working in a positive environment? Do they have advancement opportunities as a result of that? But that's also going to influence the system too, right? So are the financial incentives in place for the agency, the service provider agency, not just for the employment specialist delivering the services? When we look at the level of the employment specialist, so we see the knowledge and skills. So absolutely, they do have to have the necessary knowledge and skills, some of the experience, right? This is the training. Cross-training can be really important. But I think the other elements of that are, do they have the capacity to learn and do what's required And are they recruited to match the realities of the work situation? A lot of times when we're talking about the enormous turnover and the shortage of staff, what we find our employees are not necessarily hired because they have the right fit for the job, but because they're available to work right then. And I think this is further complicated when we go back up to that environment level and say, have we even clearly defined the roles and expectations, right? Do we even know what it is that we're really asking people to do? Because you can see it's going to be really hard to recruit people who can do that well if we're not clear on that. The motives column I really like because it reminds me of systematic instruction and everything that we talk about with customized employment, where the work is the reward. And again, what we really want to make sure of is that the people who are hired to come in and do customized employment really align with that. They find the work itself motivating. They're intrigued by the creative element of this. They're intrigued by spending time with people in their lives to learn things that they didn't otherwise know. They're intrigued by the opportunity of connecting and doing informational interviews with community businesses when you don't know where it's going to go, to just begin to see what could be there, what possible mutually beneficial opportunity might exist that nobody was really thinking about before, right? And that's what we mean by the work is the reward. Doesn't mean that we don't care about the financial and the other incentives, but it does mean that what we're hiring people for and the work that they're doing fits what it is that they really want to do, right? Which is, again, one of the hallmarks of customized employment in general. The other thing I'm going to go back to the knowledge and skills is not only do they have the knowledge and skills, but that we are fundamentally supporting these and we're supporting the learning that takes place during training. So when you see the knowledge and skills, remember, knowledge may come from training and some base skills, but the true skill of of customized employment is going to come from doing the service, delivering the service with a variety of job seekers, with access to all of the mentoring, technical assistance, and support that you need in order to learn how to do it effectively and to address any of the challenges that come up along the way. This next slide is maybe not super exciting in terms of its design, but what I'm trying to get at that I think is really fascinating is to recognize that everything that we just went through when we were talking about individual being the employment specialist, all of these factors are the same factors when we're looking at this through the view of the employment specialist, when we're looking at the provider agencies, when we're looking at the systems and funders, meaning each entity has to be looking at the different people delivering the services from their perspective, right? Then in the systems or funders, it would be the case manager or the VR counselor. We need to make sure that the supports are in place across the level in all of these different entities in order to fully support customized employment. And I think that's where we get the best snapshot of why it is that we can't just focus on training employment specialists. That if we really want to be able to enact change, we have to go back and look at that circle within a circle within a circle again, and understand that we have to be supporting this across the levels of everything. And what that means is that when we talk about this shift to customized employment and creating this sustainable foundation for change across states with access to highly improved, high quality employment outcomes, we have to really talk about the shift from this focus of a little bit of training on CE to tweak what it is we're doing and recognize that instead this is a much broader transformation effort. And what that means is that the mentoring of people delivering the services, the mentoring of the provider agencies that are changing, the mentoring of the state agencies that are beginning to change, the funders, the collaboration across service systems, the resources that they're developing, the quality assurance in terms of those universal standards, the payment structures, the credentialing requirements, all of those really become the bulk of the focus, and the training lives where the training should live, which is in the one quadrant, right? That we recognize training is this enormous opportunity to ground everybody in what customized employment really is, who can benefit, which is what the strategies are, how we can use these strategies. But then we have to look broadly beyond that to make sure that we're actually fully supporting them in everything that's detailed in the state in order to go from training to implementation. And that means that we have to plan for parity from the start, right? And that needs to be one of the core components and core focuses of these transformation efforts. This can be a big pill to swallow, I know, right? States are scrambling, everybody's scrambling, particularly right now with COVID and the restrictions and the impact on our economies on top of everything else, right? And it's really nice, I think, to think about training as being the quick fix and just coming in and doing a little bit of updated training and again, a little bit of tweaking of strategies, and then we'll be there and we're offering CE and anybody can access it. So it's tough, I know, to recognize, I think, sometimes the depth of what needs to change in order to really support it. But one of the things that I would say, and I truly believe this, is that there are enormous and broad benefits to employment service systems as a whole by creating these processes to truly support customized employment. And I think that when people learn how to do customized employment and when they learn how to do customized employment effectively, it positively impacts the delivery of all employment services. So it's actually creating the foundation for better quality employment services across the board and not just in the one group or just within the service recipients who actually would benefit from customized employment specifically. So I think there's a big, big payoff if we can get the ground underneath us in terms of how do we really deliver these services the right way from the get-go. That's really all I have for you today. Thanks to DRRP, thanks to the VCU crew for supporting this talk and for all of the stellar resources and the stellar trainings that y'all are putting out. You can find this presentation, you can find any of the presentations at their website. And again, you see the language on the grant that they have to support them here. And Terry, you may have better language on that. So anyway, thanks everyone, bye.